presenting witness testimony. And then she's allotted an undefined period of time for her to ask questions. And then when she's done with that, which I think that'll take a long time, it's kind of like an appellate or oral argument is what she's doing. Then she'll allow for closing arguments by both sides. And I'm sure that after she asks those questions for all those hours and they take a lunch break and all that sort of stuff, that we're probably talking about closing arguments towards the end of the day, and therefore maybe an opinion issued maybe tomorrow. But this is really kind of proceeding like almost like an appeal, because what the judge is going to want to do, she's going to want to ask pointed questions and get the parties to make admissions to the point she's making, so they can use those, kind of for or against them in the ruling that she makes.
And we know from Anita in the courtroom that the state has started its opening argument, basically saying troops are here, they're going to be sent to the courthouse, and this is about a balance of state power against the federal government here, that this is throwing that way out of whack. What happens here in the case that Judge Perry, and boy, this does look like it's going to go on a long time, if she rules for the TRO, but the defendants don't remove the National Guard troops? I mean, that's where we find ourselves in the constitutional crisis, no?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. I mean, that literally could happen, so the judge could rule and the troops could remain. And then the question is, what do you do? Obviously, they would be in contempt of court at that point, and they could be essentially brought before the court physically. But yeah, what do you do in a situation where you actually have federal troops? Are you really going to take steps with Illinois State Police and others to try to remove them? I doubt it. But hopefully it doesn't come to that. We don't have what you're calling a constitutional crisis.
Because it's interesting. Oh, sorry, T, you wanted to jump in. I was just going to say that Judge Perry had said in that Monday hearing that she had advised them not to be deployed.
And that was going to be my question to Attorney Leonard, because I'm reading these texts. I don't want people to think we're being rude as we hold our phones, but this is how we're getting information from inside the courtroom. And there are questions about, the troops are here. That is something that is literally in this text. Tomorrow, like you said, Paris, they're being sent to the courthouse. Will the judge weigh the fact that we have seen the National Guard show up at the Broadview ICE facility? Will that come into play here?
Well, first of all, when she made that sort of statement, I guess, at the status hearing, that's not binding upon anybody, but it's certainly something that most parties would listen to. When a federal court gives you an admonition like, hey, I don't want you to do this, even though it's not an official ruling, most people stand down and don't do that. So I think that will probably irk her. Will it play any role in her decision? I don't know. I think she's still going to stick to the law and the facts. You made a point earlier about her, sort of ascendancy to the bench. She is very new to the bench. She's kind of a blank slate in terms of written opinions. All of her experience has been either as a federal prosecutor in that building and then a state prosecutor at 26 in California. So this is something entirely new to her. And, I guess lucky that she has a lot of precedent. She'll have a lot to work with, with all the legal teams and all the arguments that are being presented. But I do still think she's going to come out in favor of the plaintiffs.
I want to read some other information that's coming in out of the courthouse right now. A presidential memorandum came in at 11:34 last night, claiming president is unable to execute laws in Illinois. The question has been raised, where's the rebellion? Are they well armed? I'm guessing that is in terms of talking about maybe the protesters in this situation. Does the president consider this a judicial insurrection? Brazen disregard for actual conditions on the ground in Illinois, and protesters at Broadview crossing the line into violence and crime are being prosecuted. So what's not being enforced in Illinois? These are direct quotes. This is not me. This is coming out of the court.
These are direct quotes from the state's argument. But, I have to say, and we talked about this last night on Chicago Report, but a lot of the protesters that were taken in and federally indicted, the charges were dropped.
They were?
Yeah.
The prosecutors didn't even follow through with them. So you've got that aspect of it, that they are arresting folks that cross the line into violence, and in many cases, they don't have a case against these folks. So it pours cold water on the notion that the president can't carry out the law here, or that they're being overwhelmed. But I'm just curious, Michael, the judge in Oregon ruled on the TRO right away, and Judge Perry here wanted to take some time to have arguments and look at the brief. Why do you think that was, the discrepancy?
I think that's a wise choice. I mean, it's very common. I mean, typically, particularly with an issue of this magnitude, you're not going to just rule on the papers. You could do it, but I think it behooves any court to have argument, let everyone make any argument they want, submit any brief or argument they want, consider it all, or at least give the appearance of considering it all, and then make your ruling. I don't see any reason why there was any extraordinary circumstance that she needed to rule just on the papers without a hearing. So there's nothing particularly unusual about that. She could have approached it that way, but I think the way she's doing is probably the better course.
It sounds like, Attorney Leonard, you think this is going to spill over maybe until tomorrow, maybe until next week.
So maybe we don't have a ruling today.
Yeah, what are your thoughts behind really the timeline here?
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if there's not a written ruling today, but I think that would still come tomorrow. So I think the arguments are going to be lengthy. The questions are going to be long, but I can't imagine she's going to go on for more than 2, 3, 4 hours with questions and answers. But that would be a real long time. But and then I think she gave 15 minutes to each party for closing arguments. So there's no reason that all the arguments and questioning can't be completed today. What I was saying is maybe the written ruling doesn't come till tonight or tomorrow. But I think she's indicated and already kind of telegraphed that she wants to issue a ruling today. So it's certainly possible to do that today. I mean, she's obviously going to go into this hearing with a set of issues that you can already start drafting a memorandum opinion. You know what the issues are. You kind of have them teed up in your opinion, and then it's not fill in the blanks, but obviously you're going to use facts from the complaint. You're going to use arguments from the briefs, and you're going to use statements or admissions made by the attorneys during the arguments today. So it's not like it can't be done. So I wouldn't be surprised if it could still come out tonight or certainly tomorrow.
I'm looking at, we talked about this court filing and mentioning, all of the pages, some of the examples in there. And actually on page 29, it's interesting that the city of Chicago and also the state of Illinois, they have a picture of what is a group of DHS agents, around 100. They're standing literally outside of Millennium Park and on Michigan Avenue. And they say they're positioning themselves in large groups on major pedestrian thoroughfares. This is a direct, statement coming from this lawsuit in tourist and commercial areas, and you literally see them just standing. What do you make of the state and the city pointing to some of these examples of, these federal agents being here? And there's no movement. There's no one in this particular picture that I'm looking at. There's no one in their face. There's no disregard, at least in this particular instance, of federal authority. What do you think of some of these examples of that are throughout the lawsuit? Because you mentioned seeing some of those as well for yourself.
Yeah, I think the state and the city, their lawyers did a really effective job of their complaint. First of all, it is lengthy. It's 69 pages, but, there's 10 or more legal counts. Those are the claims they're seeking relief upon. But what they really did an effective job was in the factual background. They did a great job with the facts. They set it up with, hey, the Trump administration, the Department of Defense, Homeland Security, they've made all these public statements against Chicago. They included, graphic postings the president has made. And then they really dug into like, hey, what are these troops doing here? There's no insurrection, there's no rebellion. They made it very fact specific. And of course, in a complaint, it could be bare bones. It could have been a 5-page complaint if they wanted it to, but it's a very persuasive document when you read it, and particularly persuasive to a court, they would hope. And it's also a PR piece. They know everyone's going to be reading it. So I think it was a very effective use of the facts and, putting the Trump administration and the agents on the ground sort of in a bad light, or a light that leads to the conclusion that it doesn't make any sense why they should be here.
And to follow up on that exact point, and we're getting some dispatches from the courtroom and the state's arguments, but basically saying that the state police claimed that ICE officials reached out to them before the troops arrived and said everything was under control. They have an email in their exhibits here showing that ICE officials said they were grateful for the help from the state police. So again, just kind of making the case that the facts on the ground don't comport to what the Trump administration has said. And that's kind of what the judge in Oregon had said, Judge Immergut, basically, that the claims from the Trump administration don't comport to the reality on the ground. And so, again, a similar argument being made by the state of Illinois here, that there's even email correspondence from ICE officials saying that the state police have, once they came in and kind of brought some order to these protests out here, things were very orderly, and there really is no danger in carrying out their missions.
Especially considering, because you said you were out there, and I think you were out there the day that barricades were brought up in Broadview. It really separated the ICE agents in some regard from the actual protesters. So when you were out there, were you able to see protesters? Because before they were able to get face-to-face, almost nose-to-nose in some cases, when the ICE agents would come out.
And then that fencing was erected there, and then there's a challenge, a legal challenge on that fencing. But yeah, the state police, the governor called in the state police, and he made a point of they're there to protect the right to protest. But when we were there, the state police, you know, and some of the protesters were upset. It seemed like the state police were there trying to just sort of provide some cover for the federal agents to carry out their mission. Now, there might have been some anger at Governor Pritzker over that, but if you look at it from a legal context, it's helping the state's argument here that things are okay, because the state police got out there, they brought some order to the protests, and there really never have been huge numbers of protesters. It's been a few dozen, and sometimes they've gotten violent, but the state police here helping the federal agents carry out. I mean, that's what the blockades are there for, so that the cars can go in and out, you know, so there's no blocking of that. So it's a very orderly situation now, as opposed to the way it's been for the first couple of weeks. But yeah, Tia, you wanted to... Yeah,
because I'm looking at more text that kind of supports what you're saying. They're talking about the sporadic protests. This is going on inside the courtroom right now. Sporadic protests, criminal misconduct directed at officials in Chicago, and they cite Superintendent Larry Snelling, that is the superintendent of the Chicago Police Department, refuting of characterization that CPD refused to help. We've talked about that before.
Well, and that's interesting, too, because that... I would guess that's going to be a big part of the argument from the federal government, that this issue that police patrols were ordered not to respond when ICE agents had called, and Snelling through that press conference and said that did not happen. The order did not come from the chief of patrol, and
that the chief wouldn't have ignored the order if it did come through.
Well, maybe I should pose that question. Mike, what do you think about that as a potential argument from the defense, this issue that the patrols were ordered not to respond when ICE agents called over the weekend, although they did end up on the scene about 40 minutes later?
Yeah, I mean, I think that would be an effective argument if that were true. It doesn't seem to have a lot of footing to it. I mean, with ISP, Cook County Sheriff, CPD, all basically saying, hey, things are under control, and, you know, having communications with ICE about those subjects, I think it really undermines the defendant's arguments that things are out of control, number one, and that number two, you know, they're not getting the help they need to enforce federal law. I think that memorandum you spoke about a minute ago that you said was just filed or recently filed this morning, I think that was an attempt to kind of get at that prong of the law that said, hey, if the regular forces aren't enough to enforce federal law, we can bring in the National Guard, which clearly does not seem to be the case. But that's an attempt to try to somehow shoestring their arguments into the federal statute that applies to the situation.
And it looks like we've got some... the defense is now giving their opening statements, and to summarize what they're saying there's tragic lawlessness in Chicago. Officers are met with resistance. Improvised explosive device recently found in Broadview. ICE spent $100,000 used in combat. There was a bounty on the head of one official. That's been reported. Ramming of vehicles, rioters gathering off-site and brought to Broadview to physically engage, and they're saying that the violence in Chicago is quickly eclipsing what they saw in L.A., where they called the Federal Guard, the National Guard there, although the judge had ruled that also was unlawful, although did not rule that they had to disperse right away.
And what you're saying, just, you know, the defendant speaking inside of the courtroom, they're saying those facts alone establish need for federalization. Based on what Parrish just read to you, Mr. Leonard, what is your take on that? Do you believe that is enough to establish need for federalization, or does there need to be more?
I think there needs to be more. I mean, first, the judge will have to first address the issue. Was there even the authority to do this? Did it have to go through the governor? She may, you know, that may end the issue right there, in her opinion. Number two, you know, is an appropriate use of the forces, which I don't think it is under the law. You know, it is something that by the law on its face and by precedent is invasion, rebellion, so things of that nature. And then the other issue is that even if they could be here, they can't engage in what are really law enforcement activities. So I think for all of those reasons, I think Perry is going to rule in favor of the plaintiffs. And the way it's moving, as you're describing it, maybe if Judge Perry only has an hour or two of questions, we will get that written opinion today or tonight. And, she could also rule from the bench, indicating that here's what she's doing, written opinion will follow. So that definitely could still happen today.
Oh, that's interesting. So she could make an oral ruling from the bench with the written opinion to follow. And is there some kind of alternate ruling where she, I was kind of confused in terms of what the ruling was in Los Angeles, where she can grant the TRO, but then also say that they don't have to go home right away? I mean, what was that ruling in L.A.? Because it's unclear.
Yeah, I'm not too familiar with that one. I mean, basically what she should be doing is either granting preliminary injunctive relief, the TRO, or denying it. Okay, if she denies it, then the case can still proceed on its merits. There still is a lawsuit pending, but the extraordinary relief, meaning stop things in their tracks, maintain the status quo, that wouldn't be the issue. So I expect her either to grant it or deny it. I don't think there's going to be any in between here. And then the question is going to be, will either side have the ability to immediately appeal it on what's called an interlocutory basis or by way of mandamus or not? Will they have to wait until there's an actual full-blown hearing with witness testimony and evidence offered, or whether, that none of that may happen? The parties are going to have to make strategic moves based upon what Judge Perry does today. But I would expect the Trump administration, if they get the TRO entered against them, that they're going to want to get in front of an appellate court by any means necessary and as fast as they can.
It was just brought up in the courtroom, the case of Martin versus Mott, in which the Supreme Court case concerning the President of the United States using emergency powers. Are you familiar with that particular case, Mr. Leonard? And I guess it begs the question here, in what they're trying to sort out, is did the President have the sole authority in this case to decide when to call up the National Guard?
Correct. Yeah, and I don't think this certainly fits the emergency that they're citing, but I don't think it still gets them around the law. And even if it gets the troops here, what they can be used for is very limited. So I still think that they're, based upon the law, the facts, the Constitution, the federal statutes at issue, I think that the defendants still have the losing hand here. So I would still expect, Judge Perry to rule in favor of the plaintiffs.
You hear all this kind of saber rattling about the Insurrection Act. If the president were to come out and just declare the Insurrection Act, what do you think would happen then?
Well, we'd be litigating that. So,
exactly.
But I don't think it applies. I mean, this is far from an insurrection, and insurrection is the level of someone moving against the government, someone taking action against the government as if to almost overthrow the system. So the fact that you have protests, they may be out of hand in some respects in some points in time. I mean, this is tame to a lot of the stuff we've seen historically here, even over the last 5-10 years. So I think they're really reaching, but of course they're going to reach. They're going to make every argument they can to fit the president's actions within any statute, executive order, any precedents they can get their hands on. So it's not surprising the defense is raising, new and somewhat novel arguments. That's their job.
And the defense just said as well that it doesn't have to be actual rebellion to federalize. President should be able to prevent acting in danger of rebellion. Also citing 10th Amendment claim does not apply to valid federal action.
President should be able to prevent. I mean,
right.
Whether they think they should or should not, there's a Constitution. There's
right.
a federal apparatus of laws.
What do you make of that?
Well, I was just going to say, if regular forces aren't sufficient to enforce the law, Michael, can you just explain that little clause a little bit? Because that seems to be a bit of a gray area.
Yeah, that's something that really hasn't seemed to have been litigated at all. So you have the two prongs that really seem to limit it to, rebellion, insurrection. And then there's other clause that says that the National Guard troops could be called up if regular troops are not sufficient to enforce federal law. I mean, on the face, I read that as regular troops, meaning the regular armed services. So I don't know if that even applies either, but they're of course going to try to argue under any prong of the statute that they can, or any constitutional argument that's different than the statute, because it gives them more breadth to argue if you can broadly argue generically under different constitutional provisions about the power of the president, the use of militia, the role of state sovereignty, and how the federal government usurps that in certain situations. So they're going to make all sorts of, hopefully well-founded attacks or good faith attacks based upon the Constitution. But ultimately, I think, again, the plaintiffs certainly seem to have the upper hand.
It's interesting that you say that, because as just happened in court, the defense is arguing that the deployment is lawful. Like you said, they will try to argue their point. They're saying that it is lawful, it is within the authority, and it is responding to urgent, serious, and ongoing threat. But I guess us being here on the ground so far, kind of like what you said, Attorney Leonard, we haven't really seen that. We haven't seen that magnitude of threat. So that is something, right, Attorney Leonard, that they will have to prove in court. They will have to show examples.
Right. Well, and I think they already brought up the cars being rammed over the weekend. That might be one example. Although, when that phone call was made to call the police, the dispatch mentioned that these are 30 armed ICE agents here asking for some backup. So it's not as if they are protected there. And also, the president does have the ability, if he believes that they need backup, he can call other federal agents. He can call ATF. He can call FBI. He could call further immigration agents. Correct, Michael? I mean, there are other agents that are within the law, the president's purview to call up that aren't military.
Oh, absolutely. There's a whole horde of federal agencies, from the FBI to Homeland Security to ICE agents. I mean, there's a lot of people that could be called up before the National Guard. This is clearly a political move, a show of strength, kind of a test of the courts, and particularly when you're reaching into another state, the state of Texas, who you're strongly aligned with politically, to try to bring their troops here. That's a certain political statement that you're making by doing that. So clearly here you even got ISP, Illinois State Police, you got Cook County Sheriff. So it doesn't factually seem like a scenario that fits kind of the picture they're trying to build. And I think it's interesting if you look at Judge Perry's background and how she'll come to this case. Her background is in law enforcement, has been really exclusively as a prosecutor. So she understands police, she understands law enforcement, she understands all the various levels and layers of agency. So I think she's probably well situated to take on those arguments and really, have a really good understanding whether they make sense or not from the practicalities of on the ground. I think she's in a great position to not be hoodwinked or to understand, what they're saying.
Attorney Michael Leonard, federal criminal defense attorney, we really appreciate you staying with us. You stayed with us for quite some time, to give us some perspective, and we appreciate your time today.
Thanks, guys. Real appreciate it. I'll be looking forward to the opinion just like you, but your analysis seems to be right on. Thank you.
And yours as well. Thank you so much.
I do want to go back to the video that we had, because we talked about the troops, the National Guard, being deployed there at Broadview, and we had past video of them being out there, but we just had the shot up out there in Broadview. You can see them on the rooftop. I don't know if we can go back to that before we go to our next interview, but it is, they're there. And so I'm sure this will come up in the courtroom to really establish why they're there. We haven't seen, at least not today, we aren't seeing a lot of violence or anything on the ground. That's the video right there of them on the rooftop. And when we went to Gabriela Primus, there were like 5 people out there.
Yeah.
So.
And that's been most of the time. I mean, most of the time it's a small group of protesters. And again, the times that it gets contentious is when you had people trying to block the driveway, but now they've cordoned that off, and they've successfully created zones where the ICE agents can carry out their business and protesters can express their First Amendment rights. So it seemed to mitigate the need for further enforcement. I want to go back though to the case the state was making, in that once they brought in the state police, there are emails the state is citing here where ICE officials are thanking the state police, saying, you've helped get everything under control. They're citing an email from over the weekend saying they were grateful for the help. There's conversations between ICE and state police exchanging kudos and managing the protests. So it does seem like the governor calling in the state police was a move that basically not only helped keep the peace, but bolstered the state's legal argument here in that the National Guard is not necessary. But, the weekend is when things have gotten contentious at
Very true.
at Broadview. But again, what is we need more clarity.
The threshold of what's considered to be, acts of violence and to go beyond really what we've seen so far. We aren't the deciders here, but to decide, at what point is it necessary to call the National Guard, I think is what everyone is questioning. The judge will have to ultimately decide on basically what she's hearing from both sides. We do want to go back to Gabriela Primus. Since she's out there, we're starting to see some National Guard activity there. Gabriela, can you tell us what you're seeing there on the ground?
Good morning, Paris and Tia. I'm keeping an eye out and I'm watching that fence behind us. We're at the Broadview ICE processing facility, and typically we see some movement of ICE agents behind that fence. Now today, just a few National Guard members. But I do want to take a closer look as we see the protesters. I am going to, we're seeing actually some National Guard members, it looks like, walking up to the fence. Hopefully we're getting a good look at that. We showed you a video earlier of some Texas National Guard members on top of the roof, and we do know now that they are from Texas. We saw that big T on their arm, so that helped us will decide that it's Texas versus Illinois, because we know that both are responding or deployed here to the Chicagoland area. We're not sure what's behind that fence that they're kind of leading into, but we know that, they've been walking around getting a lay of the facility. We saw some of them on the rooftop there, where we typically see ICE agents standing and watching some of the protesters, making sure that they also have the facility covered. But just some movement, I guess, in and out of that fenced area that's also blocked off, so we wouldn't be able to see inside even if we had a really good zoom on our camera. I do have to just be careful of some of the things that are on some of these signs. There is a small group of protesters here, but some of them do have curse words printed on them. I have the microphone close to my face here because we are hearing, again, some curse words as well. So again, small group. There's actually probably more press here.
Hey, Gabby, I hate to wrap you.
The National Guard going in and out, but I'll send it back to you.
All right, Gabby, thank you so much. We'll try to get back to you. We do have some people at the microphone right there in the Dirksen Federal Courthouse. We believe this is Lovie and Lovie. They actually filed the lawsuit. We want to listen in.
From the top.
North or south? I understand. It's hard.
That's the North and South clause of the First Amendment.
All right, we'll start again. My name is John Lovie. I'm a lawyer with the firm of Lovie & Lovie, and together with a group of lawyers, Protect Democracy, the Civil Rights and Community Justice Clinic at the Blum Northwestern Law School, Craig Futterman's clinic at the University of Chicago, Police Accountability Clinic. Have I forgotten any of the organizations?
The ACLU.
The ACLU also joined.
And First Defense Legal Aid.
And First Defense Legal Aid. A group of lawyers have filed a lawsuit on behalf of community members, clergy, and the press, seeking an injunction against lawless actions by federal officials in connection with the protests at the Broadview facility. By way of background, President Trump recently declared essentially that he was going to declare war on our city and other cities like it. He sent federal agents to, in his view, try to clean up the violence and the siege that he claimed was happening. As all of us know who live in the city of Chicago, there is no war here. There was nobody to fight. So when the federal troops got here and they were looking for trouble, there was nobody to fight, they turned their attention to attacking peaceful protesters. The people we represent who filed this lawsuit were exercising cherished First Amendment rights. They were holding signs, protesting, exercising constitutional First Amendment rights to protest what the government was doing. They were doing it peacefully, and they were doing it in a way that did not merit any violence. And they were subjected to tear gas, they were subjected to physical violence, they were shot at, less than lethal weapons were used against them, all for doing nothing but protesting what ICE was doing and what the federal officials were doing in our city. Exercising peaceful protests, they were met with violence, with tear gas, and with weapons. And they courageously filed this lawsuit, and you'll meet and hear from some of them, asking a federal court to enjoin that lawless behavior on the behalf of the law enforcement federal officers. And today, the court boldly and courageously entered an injunction prohibiting the federal agents from using violence against peaceful protesters, prohibited the federal officials from using a whole category of near-lethal weapons against peaceful protesters, against unlawfully dispersing crowds that are doing nothing but exercising their First Amendment rights. And we as a country are fortunate to live here where people can protest, they can make their voices heard, and can do that free of retaliation and free of violence. Because what was happening was people were protesting peacefully, clergy members were, exercising their faith, and the press was doing nothing but doing their job and covering it. And because the federal officials didn't like what they were saying, they meted out violence and weapons and tear gas. They were literally targeting people because of what they were saying. People were saying, some people were peacefully saying, we don't want ICE taking our neighbors. We have a right to speak out and say we don't support this. And in our country, everybody's got a right to say what they want to say. But instead of allowing those people to peacefully protest, the federal officials used violence, used weapons, used tear gas directly to silence them. And you can't do that. And today, a federal court enjoined it, and the federal court made clear that you can't do that. The federal officials have to tolerate people exercising their peaceful right to protest and their message, whether they agree with it or disagree with it. And you're going to hear next from members of the clergy and protesters and also the press, because that is a very important part of the plaintiffs' coalition here. Reporters and TV reporters and photographers are out there making a record of what's going on so that people can't distort what's going on. It's a brave job, and members of the press are doing it at risk that they're going to be met by the law enforcement officers with violence, and that's what happened. Some of the press were targeted specifically wearing press passes, clearly marked as press, and you got federal officials shooting non-lethal bullets at them, tear gassing them, trying to disperse the press. And in this country, the press play a very important role. I know they've been called the enemy and all that, but they fight through it, and they are doing their job.
So we want to chime in here and kind of bring down some of what they're saying to explain it. We want to be able to talk over this so we can explain what's going on here. This has nothing to do with what is going on inside of the courtroom right now at Dirksen.
Well, there are many things going on inside the courtroom. So this is a different lawsuit, and this is one that was brought by some press associations, journalists, nonprofits, and unions. Lovey and Lovey there, the defense attorney, basically talking about this suit that protesters and journalists were met with extreme brutality, they claim, that their First Amendment rights were infringed upon because they're saying, you cannot fire at people while they're expressing their First Amendment right. That is an infringement of the First Amendment. And one of the instances was the journalist at CBS 2 who was driving by, and there were no protests, but then an ICE agent had allegedly shot chemical munitions into her car. And I spoke with her for a good long period of time. She was telling me that she had just was driving by, observing, doing her job. There were no protests. There was no kind of safety threat. but she just felt she was targeted because that munition came right into her car, made her sick. She was throwing up for a while. She felt like her face was burning, and she felt like that was a clear violation of her ability to do her job, protected under the First Amendment.
Right, and just driving by. And also, another journalist had a situation, too. We're talking about independent journalist Stephen Held. He says he was tackled and handcuffed and detained while filming ICE agents arresting a protester. So we've had stories like that. And so that is why this lawsuit has been brought forth. I do want to kind of touch back on what's unfolding in the courtroom while this is happening downstairs.
Yeah, this is happening fast. And you've got the judge now asking some questions of the defense, kind of trying to get a sense of, well, what is it that they're here to do? Are they going to stay in Broadview?
Yes.
Are they going to come to neighborhoods? Can they engage in crowd control? Can they carry weapons? And the defendant saying, I don't know. I don't have additional info beyond what we've cited in the record. That's not a good sign for the defense there. If they're saying, I don't know, to these questions, that they don't have answers to these specific questions, perhaps the Trump administration not fully prepared, you know, for the arguments that they have to defend in court.
And also giving them a timeline as well. That has happened in court. The judge talking about troops at the federal courthouse tomorrow says no factual basis for that declaration, giving the defense until 3 o'clock this afternoon to prove why that's even needed.
Yeah.
So this is going to be very interesting. The judge is asking a lot of questions about why the troops are here. Also asking this question. They could be at neighborhoods and hospitals and schools, right? So it's very interesting. The judge is really questioning why the National Guard was brought here, and also citing some of what unfolded in L.A. as well. So it doesn't sound like you said, the defense was prepared.
What it seems like right now is exposing the fact that the defense is making these broad-based claims about lawlessness and crime, but then when the judge starts to dig into specifics, there aren't a whole lot of legal arguments that they're making, or a lot of answers that they have, you know, and so we're already on questions. The judge said she was going to have a lot of questions, and like you said, she's going to give until 3 o'clock for the defense to prove why would troops be needed at the federal courthouse.
And so,
and you know, if you go to the federal courthouse, there's giant fencing that the federal government has erected there. Which is unusual. That's usually not. We've seen many high-profile cases there, and we have not seen the need for these fences to be put up. But they are there right now, perhaps in case there are protesters that target federal judges.
What do you make of that 3 p.m. Timeline there? Do you think that after 3 p.m. we could possibly have a decision on this hearing coming from Judge Perry? Because I find it very interesting that she's saying, prove it.
Yeah.
And after that, it sounds like that's it.
And she's given due diligence, and she's given, like, you know, she could have ruled in Monday, you know, right away on a TRO like the judge in Oregon did, but she didn't. She said, let's have time to make all of our arguments here and to answer questions, and that's what they're doing. So she's giving them a lot of due diligence here to kind of drill down into, because this is a serious situation. Now she's asking, will they be solving crime in Chicago? And the defendant now saying, well, to an extent, protection, that could lead to a reduction in violence. So conflating, you know, conflating what the president has said, well, we need to go bring the National Guard in to solve crime, versus to just protect ICE agents and doing their job. Those are two different things.
Two different things, and two different things that have now been brought into the spotlight, because initially when this conversation of the National Guard came into play of being deployed here in our state, specifically in the Chicagoland area, the argument from the Trump administration was crime. And we know that you can't put all your eggs into that basket, because when you look at crime, we talked about this yesterday, you and I, crime is overall down over 30%. So that argument doesn't really stand.
And then also the governor has to call the National Guard to respond to if it's a public safety issue. But if the president is going to declare an emergency, the data that shows, and no one is saying that Chicago doesn't have a violent crime problem, but if the data shows that your murder rate is on track to be the lowest it's been in 30 years or something like that, then that pours cold water on the theory that there's an emergency here that needs to be taken into effect. Well, then why wasn't there an emergency 5 years ago when we were up near 900 homicides during COVID, or in the 90s, you know, where consistently the city was up around 900 homicides. You know, it's hovered around between 400 and 500, 600 over the last several years. But that's, again, another theoretical argument. That the other thing is National Guard, military, they're not law enforcement troops.
Right,
That's
they're
not what
not.
they do. So you can't make the argument that they're here to bring down the crime rate or to stop crime, because they're not public safety enforcers. They're here for backup. They're here for help.
And crime is not, and the judge is asking about specifically crime, and they're talking through this right now inside the courtroom. The judge saying President states they're coming to solve Chicago's crime, stop rapes and thefts. That's not a federal crime, right? So why would you, essentially
Yeah.
she's asking, why would you then want to put the National Guard here? We are looking at the Broadview ICE facility. At one point when we were looking at this, we saw just a handful of protesters, but we are seeing those protesters start to gather in numbers, a few numbers.
Friday's been typically the day where protesters really gathered, although you've got the mayor of Broadview, Katrina Thompson, who issued the hours that they can protest, the curfew. You know, at 6 p.m. they have to be out of there, you know, for the protection of the town. And I know a lot of protesters were upset about that, but, you know, Mayor Thompson bringing up the point that we've got neighbors here that need to live their lives, need to go to work, need to take their kids to school, pick them up from school, and cook dinner, and not have the threat of tear gas coming into their windows, which has happened. So so that's, you know, another kind of layer here that has protected some of the operations out there in Broadview, allowed them to be more orderly. So the judge, more statements were coming in from from Anita Blanton, who's in the courtroom, and, you know, basically the judge is saying there's a large discrepancy in what you sent me and what the president has stated elsewhere. So saying that the president is making these public claims, but then when it comes to things being sent into the legal record, there's a vast discrepancy here. And we've seen this pattern with the president. He'll make claims on social media and in the media, but then when they have to go to court and the rubber meets the road and they have to satisfy legal statutes, things are very different.
Doesn't hold up.
It's a whole different. Yeah, it doesn't hold up.
I want to go back to something that you said, and we'll go back because we're still getting, you know, text messages coming in from Anita Blanton inside the courtroom. But I want to go back to something that you said about the layout of Broadview, because I do think it's relevant. And for those who are watching who have never been out there, this is right in the middle of a neighborhood. Right? There are homes. There are people that, you know, can sit on their porches and watch all of this. We are getting some new information coming in here. Yeah,
no, this is in the middle, 25th. There's a big, busy thoroughfare there that was closed off for a little while, right off the Eisenhower. There's the border of Maywood right there, a couple blocks of Maywood, and then Broadview. All residential, largely African-American community, largely middle class. If you go down Roosevelt Road there's lots of small businesses. And lots of neighborhoods and folks that just want to their chance to live with all this madness. You know, when you get further away from the ICE facility, you see, you know, you're not really caught up in that. But then the issue is the helicopters that are constantly overhead. So it's all those considerations that Mayor Thompson has brought into play in terms of deciding on a curfew.
Yeah, I'm looking at, we just got some more text messages from inside the courtroom. The judge is saying this, so I should only look at one set of the president's statements and not others. Troubled by, at the moment, this is the judge, that when I try to nail down with you what's on the table, you have very few answers. So the defense, having all of these arguments, at least we've heard from, you know, the Trump administration of why the National Guard should come, but inside the courtroom, no full-scale plan or details of why they should.
Yeah, it doesn't look like the Trump administration has a very detailed or strong defense right now. They're talking in vagaries, and then the judge is drilling down and basically saying, I'm troubled here, that when I try to nail down what the specifics are, you don't have any answers, like in terms of where they're going to go. Are they going to go into the neighborhoods? Are they going to arrest people? Are they going to do public safety? You're not answering the question. They're not prepared here for those specific answers.
And also asking the question of why are they here? Like, what are you really bringing them here for? And so far, just looking at what has transpired in court, no real answers on that.
All right, so now we have the defendant saying, well, we hope this is the beginning of turning the corner, but we can't make representations about what the future holds and what might be needed. So again, not telling you what they're going to do is a pretty it's pretty tough to be successful to win a legal argument if you're going to not even tell the judge what you plan to do with the troops here, and they're saying, well, we don't know what the future holds. So the judge is responding, your picture of what may be needed does not reflect that of Broadview Police and the Illinois State Police.
Very vague statements from the defense. No concrete numbers, no concrete evidence to really prove their point of why the National Guard should be here.
It underscores that maybe the Trump administration has not issued a specific plan to National Guard officials saying, this is your plan, this is what you're going to do. And it underscores the PR component to a lot of what the president does. The National Guard, I'm sending in the troops, that sends a strong PR message. It rallies the base. People get excited. They retweet stuff.
Right.
But then you've got the operational part of it. Well, what are they going to do? What's the plan? What's the operational plan? From the defense arguments here, they don't have that. They don't have a specific plan. It's almost like ready, fire, aim. Let's get them in position, and then we'll determine what the plan is.
And I know, we have gone out into the communities. We've gone in the city of Chicago specifically. I, in fact, did a report on the west side and also the south side of the city, just asking residents, what do you feel about, the National Guard possibly coming here? A very small part of our population here, so it wasn't a complete sample. But I know you were talking about data, and when I went out there on the ground, boots on the ground, I heard from a lot of people that said they did not want the National Guard here, but there are some people that do, and perhaps they don't understand the legalities of behind when the National Guard is deployed and why, and really what they would be doing. They cannot be law enforcement in your neighborhood. There are still shootings in Chicago. You and I understand that. We get it. We're born and raised right here in Chicagoland, but that is not enough for the National Guard to be deployed in your neighborhood. And in fact, they wouldn't be able to stop anything.
Yeah, and there is data. There were polls that sampled a cross-section of Chicago, and about 70% saying no to the National Guard, although the number was a little higher in some of the Black and Latino communities, because those are the communities that face some of the problems, but still not even reaching 50%. And what those communities did vote in favor of, or the data showed that they are in favor of more police.
Right.
And police know the communities. Police are trained in policing, obviously, but also familiarity with those communities. And that's one thing National Guard is not. If you're bringing them from Texas, they're not familiar with Englewood or South Shore or Austin or the West Loop or Lincoln Park, wherever they're going to go. And that could be dangerous to the troops. That could be putting National Guard in harm's way here without any familiarity. But what the residents will say is it reflects the understanding that it is police that is here to police and solve crime and to, help enforce public safety regulations. It's not federal troops.
And we have heard from residents that have said, some of them understand, okay? They're not ignorant to the fact that the National Guard can't police and really do police work on the ground. But some people in the neighborhoods that I've talked to, I am born and raised right here in Chicago, grew up in some of these really tough neighborhoods, still have roots in those neighborhoods. People feel like the National Guard potentially standing in their community may be enough to stop criminals from acting. But in fact, what we have heard, at least today, from what we have heard from the Trump administration's plan, they're not in the neighborhoods. They're at Broadview. Tomorrow they were slated to go possibly to the courthouse, if that's even going to happen. That's not in the neighborhoods where, in fact, you would want crime to go down for those that are saying, come here. So, even though it would be, not the action of the governor anyway.
And that is the one case that folks have made. We talked to Gary McCarthy, the former superintendent. The one case you could make for National Guard in terms of impacting public safety is if their presence, their mere presence on Michigan Avenue or whatever, it deters smash and grab or burglaries or things like that, and then it helps police officers redeploy to other areas. But then the question is that what you want your city to look like? Do you want federal troops in camouflage standing in these, tourist areas and these nice areas? Mostly Americans don't want that. That's why we have very strict federal laws on what military officials can do. So the trade-off is maybe it does deter some of these crimes downtown, But at what cost? At what cost? We're looking like we're in a military zone or in a war zone.
And very true, because I know we're talking about the smash and grabs, which, you know, I'm not here to say they aren't a problem. They are definitely a problem in the city of Chicago. But also, is this live right now? Are we seeing a live? Okay,
I think
so
this
that
is
was
video.
video. Okay,
Yeah.
I just wanted to make sure we're looking at some file video here of things that have unfolded over the last few days. But going back to the point of smash and grabs, they are definitely a problem here in the city of Chicago. But people that live in the neighborhoods feel like their crime, you know, crimes that are happening in their neighborhood is a problem too. So if the National Guard isn't there, does it change anything?
No, but the thing is, like, you think that they can't really be armed, they can't really police, and so if they're going to a neighborhood like that, and they're just going to stand there, they're going to be in danger.
Right.
They don't know this neighborhood. B, you know, there's a lot to say that it can provoke more unrest. It can provoke more anger. Let's say, what's to stop? Let's say purported gang members from looking at them and then, you know, saying, you know what, we're not going to just sit here and allow that to happen. You just don't know.
And
you know, it's provocative, and that's why Mayor Johnson and the current thinking is that community trust is an essential part of policing. So you have to have folks in the community know the police officers, trust the police officers, or else it creates a more tense situation, and it's not safe for anybody.
Yeah, and you bring up a good point about community policing. You know, that is what the mayor and also the Chicago police superintendent has pointed to for this reduction in crime. That's what they point to right away, to say, you know, a lot of these nonprofit groups that we see working in the communities have brought down crime. So,
and they say, you know, if the president wants to help, there are, and there's that tweet that or the truth that we saw, you know, saying that the mayor and the governor should be in jail from the president. But the local officials keep saying there are ways you can help. You have frozen federal funding for some of these programs that help public safety, or you could send us more funding for more police officers, or you could send more federal ATF or FBI, which it does seem like the FBI director was talking about doing. But when you talk about the National Guard, what the governor has said, what local officials said, is that is a provocation. That is a show of force. That is an attack on the community. That is not you know, a public safety measure, because these kinds of things just provoke more unrest, more lawlessness, more, you know, anger in communities. And I do believe we have, do we have Carolyn Shapiro on the line? We have.
let's go to her.
Let's go. Carolyn Shapiro, former Solicitor General in Illinois, and obviously professor at Kent. So Carolyn would be bringing lots of cases, I think, before judges on behalf of the state of Illinois. But Carolyn, I don't know if you've been following some of the blow-by-blow here. You know, we've read off, the judge has a lot of questions. The judge has said she's concerned that there aren't many specifics from the defendants. What do you make of all that?
Well, I've been listening to what the two of you have been talking about, and I agree with your assessment that the government's inability to answer the judge's question is a real problem for the government. The statute that they're relying on allows the president to federalize the National Guard only in certain relatively specific circumstances. One of them is if the federal government is unable to, I'm going to read this, unable with the regular forces to execute the laws of the United States. And so that's part of what she's asking about. She's saying, well, how is it that you're unable to execute the laws of the United States? And how are you going to deploy these guardsmen in service of that particular that particular prong? And they really don't have answers beyond saying, well, the sort of vague sense of protecting certain federal facilities. And I'd like to add that with respect to protecting the federal courthouse, where this hearing is actually taking place, the chief judge of the Northern District of Illinois said that she does not think that the National Guard is appropriate, that there is a building security committee, that they rely on the U.S. Marshals, they rely on the courthouse protection services, and that they haven't requested the National Guard and don't think they need the National Guard to protect the federal courthouse. The other argument that I haven't seen really fleshed out yet in the reporting I'm seeing from the hearing is that the the federal government is arguing that the fact that there is a threat of rebellion in Chicago, and just the threat of rebellion in Chicago is sufficient to call out the National Guard, to federalize the National Guard. And that's a really remarkable argument here, because what the federal government is arguing is the fact that there are protesters and people who disagree with what the government is doing is itself somehow a threat of rebellion. There has been some criminal activity in mostly property crimes that the government has alleged, but nothing that comes anywhere close to a rebellion. And the notion that disagreement and peaceful protest creates a threat of rebellion is really would have the founding fathers spinning in their graves.
Carolyn, we're getting some updates from inside the courtroom, and I want to get your reaction to what we are just getting a text message from our reporter about. The judge said you reference more guns in Chicago than L.A. Just so we're clear, there is a right to bear arms. Defendants, this is what the defense is saying. People are wearing masks, preparing to go in and harm agents. Evidence of ICE indiscriminately gassing peaceful protesters. I'd wear a mask too.
Wow.
It goes on to say, the judge says, are you aware a TRO has been issued against ICE for excessive force, Broadview, and more generally? The defense says, I'm not aware.
Yeah, so that's the case we just heard
Yes.
from Lovie and Lovie, the other case, the First Amendment case. And so the defendant's saying, I'm not aware. Judge obviously aware.
Is aware of it. What do you make of that? It sounds like the defense, a lot of things that the judge is bringing up, the defense does not have concrete answers for. How do you think this plays out in the court for them?
Well, I think the judge is obviously very concerned about the facts on the ground and is trying to make sure that she's actually going to be ruling on the basis of what's actually happening. The fact that the defendants can't support their position with facts and are actually unaware of what's happening in another courtroom in the same building is, I think, it's not good for them. I think this judge is being extremely careful. She is not ruling on the basis of simple allegations. She's really trying to drill down both into the justifications for what the president is doing or trying to do, and also what the plans are, and then compare that to those justifications. And the government doesn't seem like the government is doing a very good job of being able to respond to those really quite appropriate questions.
And on that front, Carolyn Shapiro from Kent, IIT Kent, thank you so much for your expertise on this, because we're still getting more
Yes, we are.
notes from the courtroom. The judge saying, under your definition, literally all nonviolent protests would be rebellion. The defendant saying this is a case where the court doesn't need to identify the outer limits of rebellion. Defendant saying the danger of rebellion is enough. It does sound like the judge is very skeptical of all of these arguments. And we want to bring in Sylvia Perez, our noon anchor, who's been watching and listening to these proceedings.
If you're just tuning in and used to seeing us starting at noon, we've been covering this throughout the morning. Of course, we are waiting to hear on a judge's ruling on the National Guard deployment of Illinois. You guys have been talking to attorneys. You've been giving us play-by-play on what's going on in the courtroom, and you're absolutely right. As we read what Anita Blanton is texting us, it does sound like the judge is kind of saying, I don't necessarily agree with what's going on right now.
And then now the judge is, saying you have not defined what rebellion is, and the defendant saying, well, we don't have to define what it is, but there could be a danger of it. And the judge is saying danger of an undefined term. The defendant says the court doesn't have to decide exactly what a rebellion is, but this is key to the case is the president only in the case of a rebellion or insurrection can usurp the wishes of the governor here. So again, the defense struggling here to nail down specifics.
Yeah, and if you look at some of the things, specifically the one you just read, I thought this was interesting. The judge says you reference more guns in Chicago than LA. Just so we're clear, there is a right to bear arms.
Right.
And then they say people are wearing masks, preparing to go in and harm agents. And then the judge comes back with evidence of ICE indiscriminately gassing peaceful protesters, I'd wear a mask too.
She also said this, which we didn't get to. The judge said, you cited people with guns at Broadview. Those arrested, a grand jury disagrees a crime occurred. It points to lack of credibility. The defense comes back and says bringing a gun to federal property is indication of risk. The judge says they have a constitutional right. I'm struggling with how exercising constitutional rights and evidence of criminality
and on federal property. They were on public property.
They were on public property.
Road.
That's right.
Which is public property. And we just get the president's having a cabinet meeting basically saying, quote, on the National Guard, if Governor Pritzker doesn't want it, or if he does want it, we're going to do it anyway. I wonder if that means if they get a ruling here from Judge Perry putting the TRO on this and saying, no, what is it? Does the president just ignore it?
Well, did you notice?
That's more in a strange situation.
Yeah, well, from what we're seeing, and that was a question she asked them, is are you planning on keeping the National Guard there if I decide, you know, to make a different decision on this? You were talking earlier to an attorney, and I think it'd be a good time right now to kind of break down what's been going on, because this hearing started at 11 o'clock, and I think a lot of us thought we would maybe have an answer by now, but we don't. And the attorney broke it down for you in that basically each side has a chance to present their case, and then the judge has the opportunity to go back and ask questions, which is what we're experiencing right now. And we're hoping we hear a decision on this sometime today, but we'll have to see.
Well, she also gave them until 3 p.m. I thought that was very interesting, that the judge says no factual basis for the declaration of bringing the troops, and gave the defense until 3 o'clock to prove why it's needed. So it sounds like at least this may go until 3 o'clock. They would have to come up with some proof of why the troops are needed. But after that, it sounds like this might be over.
Yeah, and you know, Mike Leonard brought up the fact that the judge could issue a ruling from the bench and then tomorrow issue the written ruling, you know, so we don't have to wait until tomorrow. I mean, if her mind is pretty much made up. I mean, I'm just going by her questioning here and the defense responses. It does not seem like the defense is having a good day in court. But, you know, you never know what happens over the next few hours. But yeah, Sylvia, I mean, this is something all eyes here are on Chicago and this little suburb, Broadview.
Well, and you know, they're having the hearing in Oregon at the same time. So we are definitely the focus of the nation right now. And here's the bottom line. National Guard troops are here. We have shown video of them, and Gabby has been out at Broadview for us and is currently out there. Gabby, as we are listening to what's going on in the courtroom, what's happening out at your location right now?
Yes, Sylvia, we've been here in front of the ICE processing facility since before daybreak this morning. Really, we haven't seen much action until around 11:30 last time I was talking to Paris and Tia, and we saw some National Guard troops going in and out of the building. You know, things didn't really get active until after that 9 o'clock hour when the official designated protesting hours started, and we're seeing some protesters here. We really can't show you a wide shot because there is some curse words on some of the flags, as well as them speaking some curse words. So that's why I have the microphone so close to my mouth so that we're not catching any of what this gentleman is saying in his megaphone, something we typically see on Fridays as well. But let me show you some video that proves that this is actually Texas National Guard members that we saw on the roof of the facility. Typically, we've seen some ICE members up there, but it seems like these National Guard members were really just trying to get a lay of the land. Instead of looking at the protesters, they were really just ignoring them. Now, this does confirm it because we see that T for Texas patch on the arm of their uniform. You know, this morning we were showing you some video from overnight of those uniformed members walking the Broadview grounds behind the fence when they first arrived. They were seen walking into buildings with tactical gear, including protest shields in hand. According to the military, 200 Texas and 300 Illinois troops are supposed to deploy in the area this week. There was still little information available on how many troops will be arriving here in Broadview. I know you guys were talking about this as well. Also, if they're going to stay here or if these troops will go into neighborhoods, hospitals, schools. Remember, part of the National Guard's assignment is to protect ICE agents and facilities. I was able to talk to a couple of protesters earlier today. One man says this is his 8th time coming from a south suburb to protest. He thinks this edition of the National Guard is just part of the Trump administration's theatrics.
from Donald Trump on down to Gregory Bovino, who's the commander of the Border Patrol, what they engage in is political theater. They have their own camera crews. They're trying to create viral moments. Greg Bovino in particular to show how tough he is. Noam, the same thing. And putting troops here, which have nothing to do with the defense of the United States, is unlawful, unconstitutional, and it's despicable.
And again, we saw some National Guard members going in and out of, it looks like, another fenced area behind the fence that we're blocked by in this free speech zone. They're going inside and out of that fenced area that's blocked, so we couldn't see what's going on inside, if they're entering vehicles and going out. So there's a lot of still questions that need to be answered. I will say there's no official, as we've seen, marches or rallies happening downtown. There was that big one, of course, yesterday on Michigan Avenue. Here in Broadview, again, just a handful of protesters, but they are loud in this area, in this free speech zone. Again, at Lexington and Beach, 25th is very quiet, but typically we'll see it ramp up towards the end of the week. Friday, we're expecting a larger crowd, and of course on Saturday and Sunday as well. I'll send it back to you live in Broadview. Gabriela Primus, Fox 32, Chicago.
All right, thanks for that, Gabby. And we are joined now by Stephen Schwinn. He is with the University of Illinois Chicago Law School. Thanks for joining us. We thought by now we might have had a decision made on what was going to happen, but much to our surprise, this is now taking some time. If you can, let us know how this works when the judge is obviously being very, very cautious about how she is handling this case. There's a back and forth going on. They both were able to present their cases, both sides, and now she is asking questions specifically. What can you tell us about how this all happens and maybe why she is handling it this way?
Sure. Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be with you. So what the judge is doing is testing both sides' theories, in particular the Trump administration's theory on why it needs to deploy the National Guard to Chicago in the interest of aiding ICE agents in enforcement of immigration law. And Chicago and the state of Illinois' arguments counter to that we don't really need National Guard here to help enforce federal law, that there isn't the kind of lawlessness that the Trump administration has said surrounds ICE enforcement in Chicago, and that the National Guard really aren't needed here. And so the judge is looking at both sides of the arguments and looking quite carefully and cautiously at both sides of the arguments to make the ruling. It's taking a little bit longer than what we might have originally anticipated, just because these are fairly complicated questions.
Let's kind of go through what's going on in the courtroom right now. We are getting some more correspondence that the judge is presenting some questions to the defense, and I want to get your reaction to this, Mr. Schwinn. So the judge has said, assuming every person who assaulted and vandalized federal authorities and properties committed an offense and they were arrested and prosecuted, you believe the president is unable to execute laws of U.S. Your understanding of execute is preventing. Okay? The defense then says we're not saying commission of one crime is evidence. This is repeat and harming DHS and property and overall mission. And the judge responds in this way. Riddle me this. Drugs have been dealt in Chicago for many decades. So that means the president has had the authority for decades to send in the Guard to assist DEA. What do you make of that exchange?
Well, I think it reveals that the judge is highly, highly skeptical of the Trump administration's theory here. What the judge is saying is, look, we've had crime in the city of Chicago, as there's been, in every community nationwide. Crime itself doesn't mean that the president needs to bring in the National Guard to enforce federal law. That just doesn't make any sense. There's nothing particular about this time on this day in this so-called emergency that requires the deployment of the National Guard any more than, an ordinary street crime 2 years ago or last week would have required the deployment of the National Guard. I think this reflects a high degree of skepticism on the part of the judge to the Trump administration's theory of the case.
And we're just seeing from the judge, a big issue for the defense today is not really being able to define what the National Guard is here to do. And the judge says, I expected you to tell me they were here for immigration laws. Sounds like your argument could mean anything. So it sounds like the defense really has not come with an argument that was specific or tailored to what exactly they were going to do. I'm curious, Stephen, you know, she's going to issue her ruling, which it's leaning towards she's not buying the Trump administration's argument. But in the ruling, do you anticipate, you know, language that might resonate, that might, you know, be kind of, because judges in these rulings, sometimes they say things like the Oregon judge said the facts, the Trump administration, something to the effect of they're not comporting with reality. So would you anticipate like a strongly worded ruling here that kind of sends a message?
It could be a strongly worded ruling, and certainly the judge seems to be leaning in that direction. I mean, the problem here is that the Trump administration has characterized the on-the-ground situation in Chicago in a way that is just not supported by what appear to be what is actually happening on the ground. And moreover, as you suggested, I think quite rightly, the Trump administration hasn't settled on a firm legal theory here. So on the one hand, it's saying that protesters are impeding federal immigration law enforcement. On the other hand, it's saying that protesters are creating a kind of rebellion. And yet, on another hand, we're hearing from the White House, although we haven't heard this in the court pleadings, but we're hearing from the White House that the president has inherent plenary authority to deploy military forces in the National Guard to a city like Chicago. That's an extraordinary claim. And I think what the judge is pushing back against is the idea that these claims, if they were to wash, if they were to stick, that would mean that the president could deploy the military and the National Guard anytime, anywhere.
Yeah, that interview that was on another network where it was said that Donald Trump has plenary authority has now gone viral with people saying, wait a minute, you know, what exactly does this mean? I want to ask you this. It appears, obviously, we have to wait for the judge's ruling. But from everything we're hearing from that's coming out of the courtroom, as you have yourself stated, and it sounds like maybe that they are having a hard time trying to prove this, what happens if the judge does in fact say you cannot have the National Guard deployed in Chicago? You cannot have them where they are. You need to send them back. And then the Trump administration says, we're going to keep them here anyway, and we're going to go to a higher court.
So at that point, it's important to remember that everything that's happening right now is preliminary in the sense that this isn't a full-blown trial on the underlying merits. What Illinois and the city of Chicago are asking is for a temporary restraining order on the part of the court to prevent the deployment of the National Guard under Trump's orders. If the court were to issue a temporary restraining order, I would expect that the Trump administration would immediately appeal to the Seventh Circuit on an emergency basis and ask the court to what we call stay the lower court's injunction, basically put the lower court's injunction on hold for the time being. And if the Seventh Circuit were to reject that, then the Trump administration, I would expect, would go to the Supreme Court on the so-called emergency docket, or sometimes called shadow docket, and request the same kind of relief. But again, it's important to remember that in some sense, this is all preliminary, that we're not really dealing with the underlying merits. What we're dealing with is a likelihood of success on the underlying merits, that the underlying case will continue to move forward. Now, if the judge declines to issue a temporary restraining order, or if a restraining order is stayed by the Seventh Circuit or the Supreme Court, what would that practically mean? It would practically mean that the Trump administration could deploy the National Guard to Chicago.
Well, Paris, you were just looking up some, comments from the president that were made already this morning.
Right.
And it sounds like his plan is to keep the National Guard right here.
Yeah, he basically said, like it or not, if the governor likes it or not, we're going to keep the National Guard. We're going in. But again, they can't. I mean, if Judge Perry rules on the TRO, then they can't. But I want to also bring up a statement from the chief judge, basically to these rumors that National Guard is going to go protect the federal courthouse. The Chief Judge, Virginia Kendall, says Providing access to justice is the heart of the court's mission and critical for our democracy. Maintaining access to the courthouse for anyone who seeks redress remains a top priority. It's a core principle to the rule of law. She goes on to say she is in charge of security. She has requested additional steps from U.S. Marshals to maintain security there. She has not requested the National Guard for the courthouse. And if the president sends a National Guard to guard the courthouse, that would be over the objections of the chief judge, Virginia Kendall there, who says it is her jurisdiction to decide that. So this is many layers here, you know, in terms, and this plays into this hearing because Judge Perry is saying, well, I thought you were going to tell me they're here to just guard immigration, but it looks like you're not really defining what they're here for, and it could be anything.
And now the conversation about sanctuary cities is now playing out in court now, too. So the judge has asked the question about sanctuary cities and saying, does that mean conditions are met in every sanctuary city or state for, obviously, the National Guard being deployed? And the defense says, different situation, we're citing violence. And the judge says they're not. So it seems like, again, the judge is not on the side of the Trump administration on this. Paris mentioned, you know, that the president has said that, you know, the National Guard would stay. They would go to the courthouse is what we're hearing. What happens in that case from your perspective, Stephen? Is this then a battle of the courts to figure this out? Will it all play out in court from this point on, no matter, because it sounds like no matter what happens with this TRO, the Trump administration, specifically President Trump, wants the troops to be here?
It's a tough question. We've never really faced this kind of situation before, and so we don't really know how this would all play out. Ordinarily, an administration would comply with a lower court order pending appeal, and if they wanted to go ahead and appeal, they could appeal it, but they would comply with any court orders. If the Trump administration is declining to comply with a court order, it's difficult to know exactly what the enforcement mechanism would be then against the administration's deployment of the National Guard, again, against a court order. It also makes it really difficult to understand exactly what the administration's theory is here in deployment. It's looking more and more like the administration is taking a vast, expansive view of the idea of a rebellion or its inability to enforce federal law as a justification for deploying the National Guard in a broad, sweeping kind of way. I mean, for example, if the president were to deploy the National Guard to protect the federal courts, right? That's a pretty broad, sweeping theory of protecting against rebellion or enforcing federal law. And then just one final beat on this. If the administration's theory, as it may be suggesting outside of court, but nevertheless suggesting that the president somehow has plenary authority to deploy the military and National Guard, well, then the theory would say that even the courts can't restrain the president in doing that. That's a breathtaking theory. And again, we've never seen anything like that. And it's just not clear to me how it would play out.
And let's bring up more comments from the judge here, Stephen. The judge is saying we'd be in a different position if your argument had been we're having problems on federal property enforcing immigration laws. You have not narrowed that scope. I'm struggling to find out where this would ever stop. Help me understand if what you're proposing is really as broad as what it seems. So again, drilling down into this notion that the federal government has not really been specific. They've been very vague on what the purpose of the National Guard is. And the judge expressing some skepticism that, well, if it's just immigration enforcement, that is not what you're arguing today. What's your reaction to that exchange? The fact that the defendants still have not narrowed their scope of what the National Guard is here to do.
That's exactly right. And the judge is picking up on this and expressing frustration with the administration's lack of a kind of determinate focus on what the National Guard would do here and the theory for deploying the National Guard in Chicago. And I think what the judge is identifying is just a very vague theory of deployment. The administration hasn't really defined precisely why it's deploying the National Guard, and that might be because it just doesn't really have a great theory for deploying the National Guard. And so it's using a kind of scattershot, spaghetti on the wall approach to say, well, you know, we need the National Guard to help with law enforcement kind of generally. We don't need to specify what that means, just kind of trust us, or that we need the National Guard to put down a rebellion of some sort that the administration has imagined. And, you know, Judge, you should just basically trust us on that. And so the administration's theory here seems to be wide sweeping, kind of very ill-defined, and relying on a sort of trust us sort of claim.
Well, Stephen, before we let you go, with what we're hearing coming out of the courtroom, with what we've told you, it's sounding like maybe the governor is going to at least possibly get that temporary restraining order. Where do you see this going in the future? You know, right now, as I said earlier, there's also a court hearing going on in Oregon, and there's other states that will probably be having to deal with this as well. As you look at where we are now, what do you see coming up in the future with all of this?
It's a good question. And I think given that this is going on in Oregon right now, too, and there's a hearing going on right now at the Ninth Circuit about the Oregon case, similar kinds of questions are coming up, although maybe not exactly the same level of skepticism on the part of the Ninth Circuit judges that we're seeing here in Chicago. If the court issues a temporary restraining order, I do expect that the Trump administration would immediately appeal that on an emergency basis to the Seventh Circuit and then to the Supreme Court and seek a stay of that order. At that point, it's a little difficult to know exactly what would happen. The Trump administration has seen sort of amazing success at the Supreme Court on the shadow docket, on its emergency docket, and these emergency claims to stay lower court orders, halting the administration's lawlessness. It may be counting on the Supreme Court issuing a stay in this case as well. And I think the theory for that would be that the courts really ought to be deferential to the government in determining when the government is unable to enforce the law or when there's a kind of rebellion that the government needs to deploy the National Guard for, a kind of deference argument, a sort of trust us argument, as opposed to digging into the details and looking closely at the merits. And the Supreme Court, quite candidly, the Supreme Court has granted the Trump administration victory on top of victory on its shadow docket on a similar kind of theory, a basically sort of trust us kind of theory. And so it's hard to say exactly what the Supreme Court would do with this case, but if history is any guide, the wind is certainly behind the Trump administration on this at the Supreme Court.
Stephen, it's still going on. The court hearing is still continuing. I want to ask you about this specifically. The judge has said that there's actual evidence that shows ICE started tear gassing, sounds like protesters, and then they put on the masks first. We keep hearing from the defense inside the courtroom. They're talking about things that could happen in the future rebellions, future things happening at the courthouse. Is that enough to bring up in court to have this go their way, to talk about the future, not something that's taking place right now?
It's a great question, and that's really so much of the back and forth here. So the Trump administration is saying that there's lawlessness and rioting. What the government is saying, the Illinois government and the city of Chicago is saying, well, that's caused by the aggressive enforcement by ICE and the fact of deployment of the National Guard. In other words, the Trump administration is inspiring the very kind of lawlessness that it says that it's fighting against. And it's that back and forth that the courts are going to have to sort out. Everything that we've heard from the judge in today's hearing suggests that she's highly skeptical of the Trump administration's claims. I don't know that we'll see that same sort of skepticism if and when the Trump administration appeals a temporary restraining order in the higher courts. We'll just have to kind of wait and see how that plays out. But a large part of this is this sort of deference that the courts will traditionally give the government in a situation like this, that the deference the courts would give to the Trump administration in determining when they need to deploy the National Guard under federal law. This judge looks like it's not willing to give the judge or give the administration a ton of deference, but the higher courts might.
Stephen Schwinn, Professor, appreciate you joining us and breaking this down and your thoughtful approach to what's going on. Thanks for joining us. There's still a lot to be had. We're waiting to see what's going to happen next. We have somebody in the courtroom. And also, we're going to be talking about the ramifications of the National Guard in Chicago. With so much going on, it's impacting some events that were supposed to come and some events that are happening.
Match.
Yep, soccer is just one. And we'll be talking about that when we come back. So please stay tuned to Fox 32 News at noon.
These are the moments.
Welcome back, everybody. We are continuing to follow what's going on in the courtroom regarding the legality of President Trump's deployment of National Guard. But we have other news that we want to tell you about. And we begin with this devastating scene on the Northwest Side. 3 people are dead after a fire tore through a West Rogers Park apartment. This was the scene near North Rockwell. Fire officials say 3 victims had to jump to escape the flames. They survived, but they are now listed in critical condition. Firefighters were able to rescue 6 other people. Residents are still in shock after witnessing this horrific fire.
I was really just in shock and worried, like, you know, my neighbors and everything. You know, there's just so much going on, so much emotion. It's definitely a first for me, and I hope no one ever has to go through any of this.
Right now, it is still unclear what caused the fire. Firefighters say this building will have to be demolished in order to complete a full search. Some residents living inside a suburban complex woke up to major flooding this morning. This happened in the courtyard of a Justice Department complex after water poured into several units and common areas. Officials say at one point the water reached up to 50 feet. The property water is managed by a private company which is now working on repairs. Let's take a break here now and take a live look outside. Fall is definitely in the air, but it is a beautiful day out there. Caitlin is joining us now. Caitlin, I listened to you this morning, and I did wear a coat, a very lightweight trench coat this morning.
Good.
Yes.
You need the jacket, okay?
Yeah.
My daughter refused to wear her coat earlier this week.
They always do.
Yes, and then later in the afternoon, she said, I was cold. I was like, all right, well, tomorrow, you're wearing your jacket. 61 degrees outside. We've got blue skies, sunshine, a southeast breeze around 5 to 10 miles per hour. Temperatures are going to be staying in the 60s today. We're rolling through the weekend with the 60s, but we are seeing the mid 60s for a few of us as our warm spots there at LaSalle at 64, 63 in Joliet, 60 from Valpo to Merrillville, and in Waukegan, 62 degrees at Woodstock. So again, a quiet early afternoon. Here's your day planner. Temperatures reaching around 63 by 3, 5 p.m. 62. So we're in that low to mid 60 degree range. That's why a jacket would be perfect. Over the next couple of days, temperatures will be similar, but we do have building clouds for your Friday and a chance for a little bit of wet weather on Friday. And then this weekend, we're looking at dry skies with highs returning to the 60s, both Saturday and on Sunday, with more mild weather on the way to start off next week. We have a long stretch of dry skies after tomorrow's potential for some rain, but we are needing the rain. We had our updated drought monitor set out today. I'll show you that with our next check of the weather, and we'll take a look at the timing of that potential wet weather for tomorrow ahead. Sylvia.
All right, thanks, Caitlin. Well, the government shutdown stretches on after another round of failed votes. A live look at the nation's capital, where the House is currently on break. House Speaker Mike Johnson says he will not bring back the House to vote on a separate bill to pay members of the military. He says Senate Democrats should support the GOP bill to reopen the government. The Cubs keep their postseason alive. They won Game 3